When night came, the women lay in their barracks, unable to sleep. The music had worked its way into every corner of their thoughts, refusing to fade. Zsófi turned on her cot, listening to the night wind move through the wire fence, a faint metallic whisper against the wood. She had not felt homesick in months. She'd been too angry, too proud, but now homesickness returned, not as pain, but as ache, gentle and deep. Somewhere far away, she imagined the Danube sliding beneath bridges, lights trembling on its surface like lanterns drifting toward the sea. Mara sat up, her hands restless. She had been trained to decode signals, to hear meaning in rhythm. The songs had rhythms too, not just in their notes, but in the spaces between them, the pauses, the breaths shared between singers who understood the same sorrow. In those pauses, she had felt something shift inside her, something that no command or uniform could contain. War had taken so much, yet tonight had given her something back, a small proof that the world had not entirely broken. In the morning, when the sun struck the tin roof, the women moved through their chores differently. The same labor, peeling potatoes, washing uniforms, scrubbing floors, felt lighter, as if the air itself had changed. The guards noticed. One asked what had happened the night before. Zsófi only smiled and said, "We remembered who we are." He didn't ask further. Later that week, the Americans brought instruments again. This time, the women were ready. They'd practiced quietly, humming during rest hours, recalling lyrics they hadn't sung since leaving home. When the first guitar note sounded, voices joined without hesitation. Songs from villages, from schoolyards, from evenings after harvest. Some of the Americans clapped along, others listened, their faces thoughtful. Music became its own translation, no interpreter needed, no politics, only sound and breath and shared space. Mara sang with a steadiness that surprised her. Across from her, one of the soldiers, a young man with sandy hair, watched as if seeing her for the first time, not as a prisoner, but as someone real. When the song ended, he nodded respectfully. "That's good music," he said softly. Mara didn't answer. She couldn't find English for what she felt, and maybe it didn't need words. That evening, she sat by the fence, watching the sky darken over the flat land. The camp lights glowed pale against the blue distance. She could hear faint guitar chords from the men's side of the compound, not Hungarian songs this time, but slow American ones that carried the same longing. For a moment, she thought about her mother's voice, the way she'd hum while folding laundry. The sound had once annoyed Mara. Now she would have given anything to hear it again. Winter brought cold winds across the plains. The barracks smelled of soap, wood smoke, and boiled coffee. Life settled into rhythm, work, meals, rest, inspection. Yet beneath that routine, something human was growing between prisoners and guards, fragile but real. When the Americans came again with instruments, the songs mixed naturally, Hungarian, English, folk, hymn. The boundary between player and listener blurred. It was strange how easily music could undo everything war had built. One Sunday afternoon, the chaplain invited a local family who spoke some Hungarian. They brought violins, a mandolin, and a battered accordion. The camp yard filled with sound, the kind that carried warmth even through winter air. The Hungarian women clapped, laughed, and eventually danced, skirts spinning over the dusty ground. For the first time since capture, they looked unguarded. Even the sentries smiled. Mara hesitated at first, then allowed herself to be pulled into the dance. The rhythm was uneven, improvised, but her body remembered steps from festivals long ago. Around her, laughter and music blended until she couldn't tell whose voices were whose. For a few minutes, There were no sides, only people who remembered that rhythm and joy were older than war. When the music ended, everyone stood breathless. The chaplain removed his hat and said quietly, "That's real music." The phrase lingered in the cold air. Mara repeated it under her breath, real music. She understood now why the guards had said it with wonder. The songs weren't entertainment. They were proof of life. That night, Mara wrote in the back of an old ledger she'd found, the pages filled with neat lines of English she could barely read. She used the margins for her Hungarian words. "Music survived," she wrote, "not flags, not commands, but songs." She closed the book and lay down. Beyond the fence, someone was whistling a tune, an American song now, one she half recognized. The melody carried through the cold air, slow and unpolished, but she smiled into her pillow. Real music, she thought again. It was the same everywhere, only the words changed. Spring arrived quietly, softening the Oklahoma landscape. Grass returned in small green patches, and birds began to perch on the barbed fence as if it were an ordinary place. The air smelled of thawed earth and new rain. The women had been prisoners for months, yet captivity felt different now. The days were still measured by whistles and work assignments, but within those boundaries, small freedoms had found space to breathe. Mara began helping in the camp infirmary, her organizational skills useful for keeping supplies in order. She learned English words for the medicines and practiced them aloud while she worked. Sometimes the guards paused to listen, correcting her pronunciation with patient amusement. The exchanges were brief but human, and they mattered more than she expected. In the evenings, music remained their shared language. The Americans brought new songs, ones that spoke of distant highways, of trains crossing plains, of people waiting by rivers. The Hungarian women answered with their own melodies, slower, older, woven with sadness and endurance. When both groups played together, the differences blurred. A few of the men even learned Hungarian lyrics by sound alone, their accents heavy, but their enthusiasm sincere. One night, as the guitars were being tuned, the sandy-haired soldier who had watched Mara before asked, "What do the words mean?" She hesitated, then translated as best she could. It says, "I walk the long road home, though the road has no end. My heart knows where it began." The soldier nodded thoughtfully, strumming the chord again. "Sounds like most of us," he said. Their conversations grew slowly from there. He told her his name was Daniel. He had worked as a farmhand before the war, near the Arkansas border. His life had been simple, ordinary. He didn't speak much about combat, only about the long days and the waiting. Mara listened and felt something unfamiliar stirring, trust, or perhaps the memory of it. One afternoon, Daniel brought her a small harmonica. "You play?" he asked. She shook her head. "Then learn," he said with a grin. The instrument was old, the metal dull, but when she blew into it, the sound came out thin and honest. The other women laughed and clapped, urging her to continue. It was the smallest gift she'd ever received, and somehow the most generous. When night fell, she sat by the barracks door, trying to find the tune from memory. The harmonica wavered in her hands, uncertain but alive. The moonlight caught the instrument's surface, turning it silver. For the first time, she thought of the future as something more than distance. By midsummer, the war in Europe had ended. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers on a warm afternoon, a crackle of static followed by cheering from the American side. The Hungarian women didn't cheer. They stood in silence, each processing the news in her own way. Freedom was coming, yet the word felt complicated. Some wept for families they might never see again. Others simply stared at the sky, unsure what to hope for. That evening, the chaplain called a gathering. "The war is over," he said gently, "but peace will take time to learn." He asked if the musicians might play one last night before many would be transferred or sent home. The guitars began softly, and without plan, the women joined. The music that night carried something beyond joy or sorrow. It was farewell, gratitude and mourning folded together into sound. Mara played her harmonica alongside them, the notes trembling at first, then steadying. She looked across the circle at Daniel, who watched her with quiet pride. When the song ended, he stepped forward and handed her a folded slip of paper. "In case you ever come back this way," he said. Inside was a short address, a town she had never heard of. She nodded, unsure what to say. The next morning, the trucks arrived. Names were called. Some would be sent east for repatriation. Others transferred to different work details until transport could be arranged. Mara's name was among the first. She packed the harmonica carefully inside her coat pocket. Before boarding, she turned once more toward the camp yard where the music had lived. Daniel stood near the fence, hat in hand. She raised her fingers in small salute. He returned it with the same quiet solemnity. As the truck pulled away, she could still hear faint chords behind her, drifting through the morning air. Real music, she thought again. It had found her in captivity and followed her into freedom. The transport moved slowly eastward across endless miles of farmland. The women sat together in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Outside, fields stretched in every direction, dotted with barns and windmills. The land itself felt larger than anything Mara had known. When night fell, she watched from the small truck window as towns passed in blurs of yellow light, each one both foreign and strangely familiar. At a temporary camp in Illinois, the prisoners were allowed more freedom than before. They worked in fields, helping with harvests, supervised by local farmers rather than guards. The work was hard, but honest, the kind that left the body tired and the mind still. In the evenings, local families sometimes brought food and music. The first time Mara heard a fiddle instead of a guitar, she felt something shift again, the sound of a new place learning to speak through strings. The farmers were curious about the women. One older couple asked where they were from. When Mara said, "Budapest," the man nodded slowly. "Heard of it?" he said. "River runs through it, right?" She smiled. "Yes, a wide river." "We got one here too," the man replied. "Different name, same water." It was a simple thing to say, but it stayed with her long after. As the weeks passed, letters began arriving from the Red Cross. Some women received news of family, others received silence. Mara's envelope came thin and neat. Her parents' home had been destroyed, their whereabouts unknown. She folded the paper carefully and placed it beneath her mattress. That night, she didn't cry. The grief was beyond tears. Instead, she took out the harmonica and played softly until the stars blurred into one long shimmer above the camp. When the news of Japan's surrender came, there were no loud celebrations among the women. They had seen too much, lost too much. The Americans, however, brought fireworks. The sound cracked across the fields, startling the horses and echoing against the silos. Mara watched the bright trails fade into the darkness. The world was changing again, but she no longer knew where she belonged in it. A week later, repatriation orders arrived. The Hungarian women would be returned to Europe. Ships waited on the coast. The journey would be long. Mara felt no excitement, only quiet resolve. The Americans gave them clean clothes, food, and a small sum of pay for their labor. Daniel's harmonica remained in her coat pocket, polished from handling. When the transport ship departed New York Harbor, she stood on deck and watched the skyline fade. The sea wind carried faint traces of salt and coal smoke. Someone began singing below deck, and others joined. The song was American this time, about coming home. Mara listened, not singing, only holding the harmonica to her lips without playing. The ship docked in France, where chaos and ruins greeted them. Trains were crowded with displaced people, soldiers returning, families searching. Every station smelled of smoke, coffee, and dust. Mara travelled with 3 others as far as Vienna, then alone toward Budapest. Along the way, she saw whole towns flattened, churches without roofs, bridges twisted like wire. The war had ended, but its echo still shook the ground. Crossing into Hungary, she felt her breath catch. The countryside was scarred but alive. Farmers were already rebuilding fences, tending to soil as if determined to prove that life continued. When the train reached the city, she barely recognized it. Streets, she once knew, were filled with rubble. Buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. She found what remained of her neighborhood after a day of walking. The house was gone. In its place stood a heap of broken wood and stone. A neighbor, gray-haired and thin, recognized her and came forward. "Your family?" he asked. She could only shake her head. "No word," he said softly. Many did not return. For weeks, Mara lived in temporary shelters, helping others search for relatives, distributing supplies. Her American clothes drew curious glances. Sometimes she played the harmonica at night for the children who couldn't sleep. They had never heard one before. The sound made them laugh, and she was grateful for that small mercy. Winter came quickly, harsh and unrelenting. Food was scarce, hope scarcer. Mara often thought of the plains, of the wide American skies, of the simple kindness of strangers who had played Hungarian songs to make her feel less alone. She had left captivity, but she missed its strange comfort, the routine, the music, the faces she'd come to know. One night, while warming her hands by a small fire in the shelter courtyard, she unfolded the slip of paper Daniel had given her. The ink had faded, but the name of the town was still visible. She whispered it aloud, testing how it sounded in her mouth. The letters felt foreign, but the memory that came with them was warm. She didn't know if she would ever see that place, but she realized she wanted to. The war had ended, but for her, the journey had only begun. Spring, 1946, arrived with hesitant sunlight and muddy streets. Budapest was still patchwork, but the city was breathing again. Markets reopened, trams clattered, and music returned to corners of cafes where people gathered to remember how to live. Mara found work with a relief agency, translating documents for visiting American officers. The job paid little, but gave her meals and a cot in a warm building. Every evening, she walked along the river, watching barges move slowly beneath the bridges that had been rebuilt with steel scavenged from ruins. Sometimes at night, she would hear distant singing from a tavern and stop to listen. The songs were Hungarian again, familiar and old, yet she heard them differently now. The rhythms reminded her not of home, but of the dusty yard in Oklahoma, of guitars played under wide sky. She found herself wondering if Daniel still worked his farm, if he still carried his guitar across those same fields. One afternoon, an officer brought her a stack of letters to translate. Among them was one from the American Red Cross. It was addressed to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a brief note. From a friend in Arkansas. "Hope this finds you safe." Enclosed was a photograph of a small house beside a field, and on the porch, a man with sandy hair holding a guitar. He was smiling. On the back, in neat handwriting, it said, "Music travels faster than war." Mara sat for a long time before folding the photograph carefully and placing it in her journal beside the faded slip of paper. For the first time since her return, she felt direction again. Not certainty, but a quiet pull towards something beyond the wreckage around her. By summer, she had saved enough to consider leaving. Opportunities were scarce, but the relief agency was looking for interpreters to assist with post-war resettlement in the United States. She filled out the application, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote. It took months, but one day, permission came through. On the day of her departure, she walked to the river one last time. The water was high from spring rains, carrying branches and debris from upstream. She took the harmonica from her coat pocket and played a single verse of an old tune, the sound swallowed by wind and distance. Then she boarded the train that would take her west, toward the sea, toward the country that had once been both prison and salvation. The ship crossing was slower this time. There were no soldiers aboard, only civilians and refugees, people carrying entire lives in single suitcases. Mara kept to herself, reading when she could, watching gulls follow the ship. On the 7th night, a storm rolled in, waves slamming against the hull, lightning tearing the sky open. Some passengers prayed, others sang to calm themselves. Mara took out the harmonica and played quietly in her bunk, simple notes that steadied her heartbeat. When morning came, the sea was calm again. New York Harbor looked different now, less triumphant, more human. The docks were crowded with workers, families, translators. Signs in many languages welcomed arrivals. Mara stepped onto American soil for the second time in her life, no longer a prisoner but a migrant. She felt the same salt wind on her face, yet it carried something softer than before. At the immigration office, an official checked her papers. "Destination?" he asked. She handed him the slip of paper, its edges worn but legible. He squinted. "Arkansas, huh? Small town. You got people there?" Mara hesitated. "Maybe," she said. The man smiled slightly, stamped her passport, and waved her through. The train ride south took 2 days. The landscape unfolded slowly. Hills, rivers, long stretches of farmland. She recognized the smell of wheat fields, the same scent that had drifted through the Oklahoma camp. When the train finally stopped at a small station, the platform was almost empty. A boy pointed her toward a dirt road leading west. 2 miles that way, he said. The sun was low when she saw the house from the photograph. The porch, the field, the wooden fence. It was all there. A man stood near the gate, wiping his hands on a cloth. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled, the same easy smile she remembered. "Took you long enough," Daniel said quietly. Mara's throat tightened. "I wasn't sure I'd find you." "You did," he replied. "And I've still got your songs." He reached behind him, picked up his guitar, and strummed the opening notes of a melody she hadn't heard since the camp. The sound carried through the warm evening air, clear and simple. She stepped closer, and together they finished the song, voices blending like they had in that yard half a world away. Mara stayed in Arkansas through that first summer, helping Daniel with the farm. The work came naturally to her after years of labor on American soil. She rose before dawn, fed the hens, carried buckets from the well, learned to read the weather by the color of the clouds. The land moved through seasons with quiet certainty, unhurried, patient. She found herself breathing in rhythm with it. Evenings belonged to music. After supper, they would sit on the porch, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass and distant rain. Daniel would play, his guitar worn smooth at the edges, and she would hum along, sometimes adding words, sometimes letting the melody stand alone. The neighbors began to visit, curious about the woman with the foreign accent who knew songs older than their grandparents. Soon she was teaching them the same Hungarian tunes that had once made her cry behind the barbed wire. Children picked up the words quickly, reshaping them in their own accents. It made her laugh every time. By autumn, Mara had begun to feel part of the community. The townspeople had learned her story in pieces. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with quiet respect. The war had touched everyone in different ways, and though her past carried weight, her work and kindness spoke louder. She joined local gatherings, cooked at church suppers, and helped neighbors during harvest. When she played music, people stopped to listen, not because she was foreign, but because her songs made them remember something they had almost forgotten. One evening, while sitting on the porch as crickets sang in the tall grass, Daniel said, "When I first played your songs, I didn't know the words. Just the feeling. Guess that was enough." She smiled. "Sometimes feeling is truer than words." He nodded. "Maybe that's why they call it real music." She looked at him, the last of the sunset painting his face gold, and said softly, "It was real because it came from where we'd both lost something." They sat in silence after that, the music already between them, needing no sound to exist. Years passed. Mara and Daniel married in the spring of 1948, quietly, under the oak tree behind the house. She kept her accent, her harmonica, and the songs that had carried her across oceans. Together they raised 2 children who grew up speaking English but knew the old Hungarian lullabies by heart. When neighbors asked where she was from, she would smile and answer, "From the other side of the music." By the 1950s, the small town had grown, and people began inviting her to schools and fairs to teach European folk songs. She never spoke about the camp unless someone asked directly. When she did, her words were simple. "They played our songs," she would say, "and for a little while, we weren't enemies. We were just people listening." Time softened everything, but the memory of that first night in Oklahoma never faded. The way the guitars had found the right chords by accident, how voices that couldn't share a language still made harmony. Music had been her first bridge out of fear, her first act of freedom, her first proof that compassion could live even inside war. On the 15th anniversary of her arrival in America, Daniel built her a small stage near the barn. Friends, neighbors, and their grown children gathered under the wide Arkansas sky. When she stepped forward with the same harmonica she had carried since the war, the crowd fell quiet. She played slowly, each note a thread connecting past and present. The final song she chose was Hungarian, the one that had started it all. Halfway through, Daniel joined with his guitar, and together they carried the tune into twilight. When the last note faded, no one clapped. They just stood, silent and smiling, knowing they had heard something true. Mara lowered the harmonica, looked over the faces before her, and felt peace. A rare, honest peace born not from forgetting, but from understanding. She turned to Daniel and whispered, "That was the sound that set me free." He nodded, his voice soft in the evening air. "And it set the rest of us free too." For a long moment they stood hand in hand as the sun sank behind the fields, and the quiet around them felt like a prayer answered. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes that music can bridge what war divides. Tell us where you're listening from and what song reminds you that we are never truly strangers when the melody is shared.